तो जब एक मिनट begin. All right. Okay. Okay. I'm Dr. Tarun Chauhan. In today's session, we are going to learn the concept of hypothesis, research process, sampling, and its methods in detail. So let's begin from the hypothesis today. What is hypothesis? Or in other words, what is the exact meaning of hypothesis? So hypothesis is an assumptions, is a tentative statements or a declarative statement that is made based on some meaningful evidence. So it is an initial or a starting point of any investigation that translates the research questions into the predictions. It also mainly includes the various types of components like its variables, populations, or any relationship or any association between two or more variables or between the three and more variables. Under hypothesis, the main part of the hypothesis is research hypothesis, is that type of hypothesis which is mainly used to test the relationship between the two or more variables. Let's follow one example on the screen. For example, the consumption of sugary drinks every day leads to obesity. Or another example should we consider over here to work or to test the hypothesis between two or more variables, that is the students who eat breakfast will perform better on a mathematics exam than the students who do not eat breakfast. So this is also the one of the example where the hypothesis can be tested as it is based on two or more variables in both the examples. Let's follow up the types of hypothesis. There are six types of hypothesis. Let's begin from the simple hypothesis. This type of hypothesis mainly involves a relationship between one independent variable and one dependent variables. So if you take any example, it means if there is any one dependent variable and one independent variable, it's simply called simple hypothesis. Let's take an example. The students who experience test anxiety before an English exam will get the lower score than the students who do not experience test anxiety. So the meaning here is the particular students who are experience such a difficulty before an English test exams having the less scores or having a less marks than the students who do not experience such particular difficulty or issue for appearing the examination. So there is a one independent variable and one dependent variable in this particular example. Let's talk about the complex hypothesis. When we talk about the complex hypothesis, it mainly involves between the three and more variables. It would be four, it would be five. Such as let's take in two independent and two dependent variables. For example, the people who have very, you can say, a high sugar diets or sedentary lifestyles are more likely to develop depression. So this is one of the hypothesis statement or one of the declarative statement where we have given a particular statement which is based, and we need to prove and test the hypothesis, this statement, by using of the statistical tools like we can say the t-test, z-test, and any other test or a correlation as well. Let's talk about the null hypothesis. Null hypothesis stands for no relationship between two or more variables. Let's take another example that there is no relationship between the family expenditure and the income. In another example, which is given on the screen, that there is no difference in the scores on the memory recall task between the children's and adults. The another type of hypothesis is the alternate hypothesis, which is a very opposite to the null hypothesis. If I say there is no relationship between the family expenditure and the income, so under alternative hypothesis, I could say there is a relationship between the family expenditure and the income. So such hypothesis is always shows that there is a relationship between two or more variables, or there is a relationship between one or two variables. Let's take an example, another example, that is the adults will perform better on a memory task than children's. Let's talk the statistical hypothesis. Statistical hypothesis is one of the type of hypothesis where the statistical tools or representative will be used to test the hypothesis. If it is also includes the experiments as well, like we can say the scientists would also hypothesize that a chemical spill in a river is causing a decline in the fish population. So under this statement, under this declarative statement, a hypothesis testing would be used to analyze the data, to collect the data from the river and then determine it whether the statement is supported by the data or not. So that's called the statistical hypothesis, where it is mainly used to evaluate a representative population sample and then accordingly generalize the findings to a larger group. When it comes to the statistical hypothesis, it applies to a smaller group of samples as well as the larger group of samples. So, in a very long research papers or a research reports, mainly a larger group of samples will be considered in case of hypothesis, the statements. Let's talk about the logical hypothesis. This hypothesis assumes a relationship between the variables without collecting data or evidence. For example, an alien raised on Venus would have a trouble breathing issues in Earth atmosphere. It means that we are already making up or preparing a declarative statement which is almost based on the evidence in the earlier types of the hypothesis. But under logical hypothesis, definitely we assume a relationship between the variables, but without any collecting data, without any evidence. If we are making any statement or we are preparing any statements that states a relationship between the two or more variables without any evidence or without any collecting or data, that's called logical hypothesis. These are the sources of hypothesis where you can make and prepare the declarative, or you can say the assumptions based on the following parameters. You can make or assume a statement based on the theories or based on the observation, based on the comparison between the two variables, that's called analogies, intuition or any based on personal experience, and based of the studies or existing studies, or you can see any of the earlier before the 10 years of studies. The hypothesis could be formulated based on the state of your knowledge of any subject area or any of the research topic, based on the culture, based on the continuity for research. So when you are already prepared a research paper, then accordingly you will also continue the research and then prepare or formulate the hypothesis based on the research topic that you are going to prepare in the upcoming period. Let's talk about the steps in research process. So before I come to the steps in research process, let's define the research process is. Research process is a series of the procedures, a step a particular researcher has to follow to prepare a research objectives or research questions. When we talk about the research process, we all the researcher has aim to formulate the issues so that accordingly they can prepare the objectives and questions to minimize their time, effort, and money so that to conclude a meaningful evidence. That's called the research process. So there are around 9 steps in the research process. So let's begin from choose a topic. It is very important step under the research process where a researcher has to choose a particular subject area, a particular topic which denotes some issues so that a research can be built up, and accordingly whatever the studies has been conducted, a particular researcher investigate in depth on that particular topic. Let's talk about the review of literature, or in other words, it's called a literature review. Literature review is a process of investigating the existing studies where a researcher will get insights about the topic, about the conclusions, about the expected outcomes of the study, which is relevant to his present topic. That's called the literature review. Let's follow up the next step, that is formulate the problem. Formulating an issue is one of the most important step of the research process because it is a step where a particular researcher build a particular set of research objectives, or we can say a set of research questions. So it is very important to find out the issues in your particular research topic, and accordingly you can formulate your research objectives as well as the research questions. So it can be done by following up the various approaches like observational survey, like preliminary survey, experiments, interviews within a smaller group of people. So when you have follow up these approaches, you will get to know the issues related to your topic, and accordingly you can formulate the topic. The next one is develop the research question. So once you formulate the issues and the problems, and accordingly you set up the research objectives, then it is a very easier step to develop the research question which are totally based on your research objectives. So it is very important that to develop the research questions when it comes to the master's levels projects or thesis or the PhD level thesis. So let's come to the it has always been in the questionnaire form. Let's come to the next step, choose and organize the research design. Research design is a blueprint of the whole research process because it is a step where a particular researcher will design that how the research will goes on, or how the research will come to an ending process. So that is the one of the most important topic, and automatically the whole research depends upon the research design because actually it is the plan of the whole research in as a whole. So let's come to the next is gather the data. So once you decide the research design, whether it would be a quantitative approach, whether it would be a qualitative approach, whether a particular you can see selecting a primary data or secondary data. So once a particular researcher select the type of data, it could be either a primary data or it could be either the secondary data. So primary data is the original data, is a first-hand information by a researcher, collected by a researcher, or Secondary data is a second-hand information which has been used from the existing study. So the next step is gather the data. So once the researchers select whether it would be primary data or secondary data, so accordingly the researcher begin to gather the data either at the primary or secondary. So once the primary data or the secondary data has been gathered or collected from the respondents or participants, which has been an equal chance in a research study. So the another step is analyze the data. In the case of analyzing the data, there are the various steps to be used. First is the data which will be collected as a raw data. Then raw data is converted into the coding, and then the coding, once the coding has to be done, then it will be analyzed through the software. Or once the data has been analyzed through the softwares, the particular data has been represented in the form of tables, diagrams, either pie chart, bar chart, or histogram, and accordingly we will get the particular data in the form of tables, in the form of diagrams. So once we analyze the data, then we come to the next step, that is the interpretation of the data or interpret the data. So what is the meaning of interpretation? Is interpretation means whatever has whatever the data has been shown in the tables, you have to define that data, what the data actually portray to the readers, what the findings has been come from the data, from the results. That's called the interpretation of the data. So once the interpretation has been done, the next or the last step of the research process is communicate the findings. Once the exact results has been come out from analyzing and interpretation the data, then whatever the results has been come out, then we communicate to the readers about the findings of the study, that these are the meaningful evidence, these are the meaningful findings that can be communicated to all the readers either through the offline sources or the online sources or through the different public advertisements, either online or offline. So this is the exact 9 steps of the research process where a researcher has to follow up when it comes to prepare any research report, when it comes to prepare any research thesis at the master's or PhD level. Let's talk about the sampling. So what is sampling here? The next step is sampling means it is a process or selecting a particular group that you actually collect the data from in your research. So it is a process of collecting the data from a set of individuals, or we can say a set of you can say people or a persons to whom you can collect the data which are very useful for your research. That's called sampling. For example, if a particular researcher would like to collect the opinions of the studies in your opinion of the students in your studies, you could survey a sample of 100 students. So that's called sampling. In a particular context of statistics, sampling allows to test the hypothesis about the various characters of a population, either would be the gender wise, whether it would be the age wise, whether it would be the occupation wise, or would be anything that is very useful for the research. Let's talk about the basics of the sampling theory. The first one concept is population, where that what type of population would a particular researcher has to study. If a particular, we talk about the university, we talk about the organization, we talk about the community, we talk about any casteism or religion group, that's called population. So one of the example that I considered over here is all the students in a class, that's called population. So all students is a population. in a particular class. If we say all students in a school or university, that also considered as population. Next one is element. Element means it would be demographics, it would be geographics, it would be psychographics. Demographics, we always talk about the socio-demographic variables, that is age, gender, height, weight, blood pressure, even you can say sugar, diabetic level. That's called demographic variables. Geographic variables are those variables which are related to the religion, which are related to the cities, regions, etc. Psychographic variables are those variables which are belong to the anxiety level, stress level, depression, and many more, or etc. Let's talk about the next basics, that is defined target populations. It depends on the study of a researcher that what he's willing to include or to target the exact population. It would be the population of a country, it would be a students of a university, it would be the any consumer or customer base of the company. Next is sampling units. The units would be a particular researcher to whom is willing to collect the data. It would be either individuals, it would be either households, it would be organization, it would be from the regions, it would be from the cities. They are all called the units. That's called sampling units. Let's talk about the last basic concept, that is sampling frame. Sampling frame, it could be any object, it could be any idea, and whatever in that particular object, the sub objects would include. That's called, and how you frame into your study, that's called the sampling frame. For example, in the opinion poll, it includes the electoral register or a telephone directory. So both would be included. A researcher can use any one of them when he is willing to study any opinion poll of the respondents, of the participants, of the particular individual or the population of a country when it comes to collect the data. So that's the frame that he has to use. Let's talk about the sampling error. So sampling error would be any type. It relates to any type of errors or base that relates to a mistakes, either drawing a sample or the sample has been wrongly drawn. Oh, that so sample size has been wrongly taken in a study. So when anything or any mistakes occurred in drawing a sample frame or determine the sample size, it would be 100. Suppose a particular researcher has to take a sample size of 100 samples, but actually by mistake he took 50. That's called the sampling error. Sampling error is also called the statistical error. It occurs when a particular analyst or a researcher does not select a sample that represents the entire population of a data. That's called the sampling error or a statistical error. As a result, whatever the finding has to come, it does not represent the exact outcome or exact meaningful evidence which need to obtain from the entire population, and that's called sampling error. For example, a particular analyst or researcher has to collect the data from a group of participants, but unfortunately he couldn't represent that data from the population. That's called the sampling error by mistake. So if you're asking a group of ninth grade students that about what they believe the speed limit should be on the highway, that's called the that's called the sampling error or sampling base, because for the ninth grade student doesn't know and doesn't know that how what to believe about the speed limit or which should be on a highway. That's exactly the sampling error, because the data couldn't be collected accurately, which represent the entire population. Next, we talk about the developing a sampling plan. So the first one is define the population of interest. Second one is identify a sampling frame if needed or if possible. Next one is select a sampling method. Fourth one is determine a sampling size. Sampling size is that particular value where a particular researcher willing to collect or from that particular you can say value, that's called the sample size. And the next one is execute or follow up the sampling plan. So let's go on through one by one step. The next one is defining the population of interest. The population of interest, it depends or entirely dependent on the management problems, research problems, and research design. Whatever the issues comes, it's related to these problems only. Either would be management problem, either would be the research problems, or either would be a research design problems. So it depends that what population of interest a particular researcher has to or, and it entirely dependent on these three problems. Some basis of the defining population, that population can be defined on the basis of geographical reason, on the basis of demographics, on the basis of a usage or lifestyle of the people or of the population. And the next one is awareness of the customers or consumers or the people who are living in the various cities or reasons. That's called that called the basis for defining population. Next one is sampling frame, a list of population elements that's called people, populate companies, houses, cities, from where the units or the sample is to be collected, or where the units is to be sampled can be selected. So that's called the sampling frame. But one of the disadvantage of the sampling frame is it is very difficult to get the accurate list. So if we prepare a list of population elements from the for other people or either from companies or from houses or cities, where the which units is to be sampled, which can be selected. So sometimes it is difficult to get the accurate list of the population, you can see elements. So sample frame error occurs when the elements of the population are accidentally omitted or are not included on the list. That's called the sampling frame error. If you see some of the good international sampling surveys, or you can look up the website, that is www.surveysampling.com. Let's talk about one of the most important topic that in this particular code, that is MMPC 15, that is the sampling methods, that it divided into two categories. The first one is probability sampling and the second one is non-probability sampling. Now we talk about the types of sampling methods which comes under the probability sampling or and which comes under the non-probability samplings. So let's begin. Probabilities. Under probability sampling, simple random sampling technique or method, systematic random sampling, stratified random sampling, cluster sampling. Let's talk about the non-probability sampling, convenience sampling, judgment sampling, quota sampling, and snowball sampling. So these are the various types of sampling methods under probability and non-probability category. Let's talk about simple random sampling method or technique. Simple random sampling is a method of probability sampling in which every unit or every participant or every individual has an equal chance of being selected in a research study, and that's called simple random sampling. Under simple random sampling, every unit has an equal chance of being selected in a research study. For example, each member in the group is marked with a specific number since the selection of item completely depends on the possibility. And this method is called the method of chance selection. That means if a particular researcher is willing to collect the 100 samples, that means 100 individual will get an equal chance of being selected or have a possibility of including in a research study, and that's called simple random sampling technique. Systematic random sampling technique. Systematic random sampling technique is a method of probability sampling which defines the target population is ordered. So the target population is accordingly arranged in a order wise, and then accordingly the sample will be selected based on the position using the skip interval. Skip interval is a reciprocal or it is a process of dividing the sample population into or to the sample size. That's called the skip interval. So let's follow up the example to have a more clarity on this particular concept. Systematic random sampling is also called the probability sampling method, where a particular researcher assigned a desired sample size of the population and assign a regular interval number to decide who is in the target population will be sampled. The sampling interval is divided or decided by dividing the population size by the sample size, which I already told you to define systematic random sampling. For example, if you had a list of 1000 customers, that is your target population, and you want to survey a 200 of them, so what would be your sampling interval? The sampling interval would be the 1/5. Sampling interval is a reciprocal of the numerical value that will gain from dividing the sample size by the population size by the sample size. So 1000 divided by 200, it would be 5% or 5/5 item, we could say. So sampling interval would be 1/5. That means 1/5. So this means you would select a sample of every fifth person in your list of 1000 customer. Okay, let's assign a number that is fifth person. So let's begin of collecting the samples. So let's begin from the second person. So fifth person I have to select. So now I will select the seventh person. Now I will select the 12th person. Now I will select the 17th person. So I am selecting every fifth person of the particular samples being collected in a research study, or from the 1000 customers. So from the 1000 customers, I have to select every fifth person from 1000 customer, and accordingly I have to collect the data from the fifth person, which is being calculated using the formula that is sampling interval. So sampling interval is a reciprocal of the numerical value which is being estimated by dividing the population size by the sample size. So in the example we get the fifth person. So every fifth person is being selected or is being sampled from the 1000 customers. Let's talk about the stratified random sampling. So that means when it comes to the term stratified, that means every sample is collected from the stratum. It means from a group. Let's begin. Stratified random sampling is a method of probability sampling in which the population is divided into different subgroups or the samples are selected from each subgroup. So when we talk about stratified, it means the sample is to be collected from the groups. It would be either subgroups or it would be a smaller group, it would be a larger group, right? The odd will be a different groups. That's called stratified random sampling. So if any researcher willing to collect the samples from different subgroups or different groups, either smaller or larger, and accordingly the data is collected or sample is collected from that particular subgroups, that's called stratified random sampling. So let's begin the steps in drawing a stratified random sampling. The first one is divide the target population into a homogeneous subgroup. So whatever the target population, it would be the male and female, it would be whether the students, it would be any customers or it would be any consumer base of the company. This is the target population, and then such population will be divided into homogeneous subgroups. It's according to the age, is according to the gender, is according to the occupation, is according to the income level, is according to the we can say expenditure, or it is according to the height, weight, or it according to any other variables or any other group. So this is the first step of stratified random sample, that divide the target population into a subgroups. Then draw the random samples from each group or stratum. So it depends. Random sample, it could be taken according to your convenience, according to your wish, or according to your choice. So you can draw any of the random samples from each group. Between like divided into 10 samples from each group. So that's called draw a random samples. Next one is combine the samples from each group into a single sample of the target population. So in the third step, you have to combine all the samples from each group and just translate and convert into a single samples of which represent the entire target population. That's the one of the third last step of stratified random sampling draw. Next one, the most important point is stratified random sampling is also called by various names, that is the proportional random sampling or a quota random sampling. So don't be confused. So if a short note has been asked, that is quota random sampling, so it's a stratified random sampling, the same. Let's talk about the cluster sampling. Cluster sampling is also the one of the type of probability sampling where the researchers divide the population into a multiple groups. That means clusters. So if we talk about the subgroups at the small and large, if we talk about the stratified random sampling, but what comes under the cluster sampling is when a particular divide the population into multiple groups, right, in a one take. That's called cluster sampling. So researchers select the random groups with the sample, simple random or stratified, or you can say systematic random sampling technique for the data collection or accordingly for the data analysis. This particular sampling technique is used in marketing research. For example, it is given the example for you. An example of the cluster sampling would be the survey conducted by a company to better understand the preferences and the needs of their customer. The company will divide the customer base into a clusters based on their age, gender, location, city, income, occupation, and then select a random sample from each cluster for further analysis. And that's called the cluster sampling. When a researcher divide the particular target population into a multiple groups based on their, which has already shown age, gender, location, income, expenditure, height, weight, and accordingly they will select the random samples from each cluster for further analysis of data, and that's called the cluster sampling. The next one is non-probability sampling techniques. So convenience sampling, it relies upon the convenience or the assess. Judgment sampling, it relies upon the belief or the experience of the participants. Quota sampling focus on representing of a specific characteristics. That means it's collecting or the samples are collecting from different characteristics of different you can say individuals, that called quota sampling. Snowball sampling relies upon the respondent's referral of others, where the persons or the participants who don't know, who are not aware about the topic, and they use the referral, they use the others' references or friends to friends references to know about the topic, to get aware about the research topic, and that sampling is called snowball sampling. So let's read one by one the types of non-probability sampling. Convenience samples is the samples which are drawn according to the convenience of the interviewer and the people who are very easily to make the selection at familiar location and to choose respondents who are like themselves, who are very convenient to get the samples in a selected locations or in a selected cities or the areas, and that's called the convenience samples. Judgment samples, the samples that requires a judgment or an educated guess on the part of the interviewer who should represent the population, and that's called the judgment sampling. So judgment sampling is a process where the sample is being collected according to the judgments or according to the any educated guess or education guess on the part of the particular interviewer who represent the entire population. So here the judges or the judgment we are also called the informed individuals, where may be asked to suggest who should be in the sample. So that's called the judgment sampling. Quota sampling are the defined as a set of the specific number of a certain type of individuals to be interviewed, whether it would be doctors, whether it would be PhD holders, whether it would be any the persons who belong to the defense industry, defense, you can say characteristics, and the persons who belongs to the hospitals. So it's called quota sampling, where a particular quota has been denoted to the particular individuals, and accordingly the individual is to be interviewed for a particular research study. Let's talk about the snowball sampling. Snowball sampling, also known as the chain reference sampling, where the person who are not aware about the future subjects for a particular study, they will get all that particular information, all that studies from friends to friends, from friends, you can say references, where we can where the researcher can easily get the participants and get familiar about the future subject for their own research study, and that's called the snowball sampling. Let's talk about the factors to consider in a sample design. The first one is research objectives. It is very important when it comes to design the samples. How, what would be the sample size? How would you sample units? How much would be taken? That how you frame the sampling, you can say, or a research design. So before that, research objectives are very important factor where a particular researcher has to formulate first. So that is the degree of accuracy. So when the particular researcher formulate the research objective, it should the objectives should be formulated according to the accuracy. The objectives should be accurate and well defined, so that a particular sampling design has to be framed. Resources are very important, because whether it would be the library resources, whether it would be the online resources, whether it would be the you can say the journal resources, whether it would be the book resources, it is very important when it comes to define, or when it comes to frame any sample design. Time frame is also one of the important factor, that in what time period you will finish your study. It would be in a 4 months, it would be in a 6 months. So you have to plan accordingly, you have to design accordingly the timings, that in whatever the time period is required to formulate the research objectives, what would be the what time period is required to collect the resources which are relevant for your study. So this is called the time frame that a particular researcher has to set up according to their own requirements. Next one is knowledge of target population. It is very important for a researcher, and is also one of the important factor when it's come to the sample design, that a particular researcher must be well defined, must have well defined knowledge about the target population, whether it would target the customer base, whether it would target the consumer base, whether it target a particular you can say individuals. Research scope, it is also the one of the factor, that whether whatever the research objectives, whatever the research questions, whatever the research design has been formulated, whether has have a wider scope in research, or whether the possible outcomes it could portray a meaningful evidences to the readers or not. So that also one of the important factor to consider the sample design. So whether the scope is so meaningful in research that whatever the samples is to be collected is exactly portray the accurate results or accurate outcomes for its own study. So that is also the one of the factor that it needs to consider by a researcher. And the next one is statistical analysis needs. It is also the one of the important factor, that how the data has to be analyzed statistically, who will or how it will be analyzed. So this is also the one of the need when it comes to design the samples. Let's talk about the data collection. So data collection is a very wide process, and a particular researcher has to decide one of the method of the collection for its own research study, but sometimes the researcher is not select exactly the one method of collection of data. Instead, it will select the multiple methods of data collection. It isn't necessarily that a particular researcher select only one method of data collection. It could be select two or more methods of data collection so that to get the accurate findings, to get the meaningful findings for the researcher as well as for the reader as well. So every method has the advantage, pros and cons that must be weighed up in view of a rich and complex context. It is very important to understand that whatever or which one of the data collection method is being used for your research study. Every method has its own advantage and disadvantage, and accordingly they have to be weighed up in view when it comes to the rich and very complex context or environment. So these are data collection process. So all methods requires a very comprehensive, rigorous, and the systematic design and execution as well. That includes through planning, a well-considered development, effective piloting, weight modification, deliberate implementation and execution, and appropriate management analysis. So it is very important that all these steps or procedures has to be followed when you are collecting the data or when you are in the process of collecting the data or for your own research study. So it should be proper planning, it's a proper well-developed objectives, and accordingly you will collect the data and the effective pilot studies that once you collect, you have to analyze that whether the data or samples which collected is actually portraying a meaningful results or not. Fourth one is weighted modifications. Whenever the modification is required, it is very important to modify it, then implement and execute the plan. Then next is appropriate management and analysis needs. So next talk about the surveys. Surveys, as I already told, the survey is the most important method of collecting the data without which no study is capable to complete on time. So survey involves gathering information from individuals using a questionnaires form. So whether it would be structured questionnaires or whether it would be unstructured questionnaires. Structured questionnaires set up of rules and regulations, and set unstructured questionnaires we doesn't define any set of rules or regulations to form a questionnaires or to form a questions. Surveys can reach a large number of respondents. It all the results can easily generate standardized, quantifiable, empirical data as well as some qualitative data as well. It offers confidentiality and anonymity. So a survey can also depends design accordingly to the requirements of the researcher, and definitely whatever the instruments would be used in survey that will generate a credible data. However, it could be difficult when it comes to survey because it doesn't necessarily whatever the information has been collected, it actually an accurate data, or it actually the particular researcher depended on that data. So that's true, the survey generate the credible data, but it doesn't mean every time it is also difficult to rely on that particular data because sometimes the results would be inaccurate. These are the types of survey. Descriptive or exploratory surveys involve entire population or samples of population or capture a movement of map trends, whatever the diagrammatic or environmental or rainfall trends. Always the survey is the best tool of collecting the data. It it can be administered in a number of ways. Accordingly, you can formulate the questions and do the survey from a large group of population. Survey constructions, we have to formulate the question response categories, then write up the background information and accordingly instruct the respondents or participants, then always work through the organization and length of time, and then determine the layout and design. So that is the construction of the survey questionnaires. The next one is interview. Interviewing or interview. Interview involves a face-to-face communication between the interviewer or the interviewee. So it also asks the questions related to the open-ended question. It can also generate the standardized and quantifiable data, and of course more in-depth qualitative data as well. Definitely, the complexities of people and the complexities of communication are exist, and of course, it would be a many chances or many opportunities could created for miscommunication and misinterpretation when it comes to interview of various respondents. Interview types, it would be formal to informal, it would be structured to unstructured, it can be one or more or involve groups. So these are the ranges from when the interviewer comes to formal interview to informal, then is structured interview or unstructured, can be involve one, two or more involved groups. Conducting interviews, you will need to put up a question, then prompt and prompts in ways that will help to gather a rich data. It also actively listen and make sense of what is being said and manage the overall process of conducting the interviews. So sometimes the interviewer could be very friendly, sometimes the interviewer would be very strict. So accordingly, you have to answer and the questions, and the interviewer accordingly will gather the data from the respondents. So that is the main reason to conduct the interviews, to get the rich data, and that rich data will be tabulated, analyzed, and interpreted, and accordingly communicate to the readers. And that's the main focus of the collecting the samples. Next one is observation. Observation relies on the researcher's ability to gather data through their senses. So it's all about your sense. It's all about your observation skills. Whether you observe, whether you collect the data based on their actual behavior, whether you collect the data based on your own senses by observing the particular respondents. So this is the one of the method of observation. So the observed can act differently. The same observations cannot be analyzed. So observations are should be different, and observed can act differently when survived, and the observations can be tainted by the researcher worldview, because whatever you observe you have to write and speak based on your observations. So it is a researcher worldview that reach to a larger group of population. So that's called the observation method. Observation types are the non-participant to participant observation, candid or covert observation, from structured to unstructured observation. So these are the ranges, these are the types of the observation which can be easily defined. The observation process is sometimes treated casually when it comes to the classroom, when it comes to the schools, when it's come to the university. But it is also one of the method that needs to be treated rigorously as any other method, whether it would be interview, either it would be questionnaires. So the process which include while observing should be proper planning, proper observing, proper recording, proper what you observe is reflect something, and authenticate it. So whether it is an authenticate observation, among a large group or a smaller group of respondents. Experimentation is always denotes a relationship of cause and effect of the variables. Either you can manipulate the independent variables to see the outcome of the changes in the dependent variables. So that's called the experimentation, or in other words, experiments. So experiments like it's always portray a cause and effect relationship by manipulate the independent variables to see where if there any correspondence change or effect on a dependent variable or not. So experimentation is pure experiment requires controlled environment and the use of randomly assigned control group. It is very important that experimental group and control group will be very important groups where we see the exact cause and effect relationship. So controlled group is also one of the important part of experiment where the when after the treatment it is being tested and whether such group is being controlled for various type of difficulties, other diseases or other human you can say cause of depression or psychological issues. That's called that comes under experiment. This can be difficult to achieve in human-centered experiment, which is being conducted in the real world. That's we can see sometimes a new type of cancer will be very difficult to experiment in the real world because none of the researches has been done. Like for example, is a case of COVID-19, is a case of Ebola virus. So that is also the one of the plenty of experiment has been done so that to get a vaccine and to reach out the larger group of population. So that's the one of the example of experimentation. That's it for today. In the upcoming session, I will more include the most important topics. So आज के लिए इतना ही. uh, धन्यवाद and namaste to all. Thank you.